welcome all of you to Carl Sagan Fest, our annual celebration of science and humanist values. The Humanist League is a values-based community with weekly discussion meetings to explore life's big questions. We work to bridge humanity's differences through building common understanding through reason and compassion. We meet Mondays at 4:30 p.m. in Wien Hall, room 5312, and welcome anyone from the university community who brings an open mind. Please write your email address on one of the sign-up sheets in front of the auditorium or at our reception if you wish to receive our email announcements. Today's event would not be possible without our sponsors, the Dietrich College of Humanities and Social Sciences, the Dietrich Humanism Initiative, Mr. Lowell Steinbrenner, and the Joint Funding Committee of CMU. I wish to thank them all, and also our wonderful exec board and volunteers. I will now hand this over to Jeremy Huang, our events coordinator, to tell you more about the event.
Every November, the Humanist League partners with the Dietrich College to host a celebration of science and humane values. We call the event Sagan Fest in honor of the late Carl Sagan, the Cornell astrophysicist who made incalculable contributions to the public understanding of science, most notably through his public television series Cosmos, as well as his many books. His works are imbued with an insatiable curiosity and an infectious wonder, a timeless attitude that will serve us no matter who we are. Carl Sagan famously said that if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe. We think that this is an excellent excuse to serve some apple pie. So after this event, we hope you'll join us in Rangos 1, which is a room almost immediately above where I am now, for the apple pie and some friendly conversation. Now, before we continue, I would like to, I have to give you two little reminders. So the first one is, please silence your phones. And since today is an election day, I also want to assure you that you will have at least an hour and a half to get to your polling place after this event ends, if you have not voted already. All right, continuing. Our Sagan Fest would not be complete without the Sagan Day Award. Our faculty advisor, Dr. Andrew Norman, will now tell us more about this award.
Thank you, Jeremy. Can you all hear me okay? All right. I know you're eager to hear from our guest. I am as well. What's about to transpire, though, requires a bit of context. I'll be brief. Jeremy mentioned that I direct the CMU Humanism Initiative. The initiative seeks to build community around the values central to science and, more generally, honest inquiry. For thousands of years, people have built their identities around more or less arbitrary tribal commitments. We now know, though, that this is a very bad idea. It breeds dogmatic thinking, tribal division, and unnecessary conflict. But what's the alternative? Well, we can build communities that celebrate open-mindedness, collaborative inquiry, and reason-giving dialogue. Such communities can provide a sense of belonging, and with it, identity options that most people never consider. Identities like humanist, skeptic, or rationalist. Here at Carnegie Mellon, we've built a vital community of inquiry that supports stable identity formation for a life that truly matters. We think that this is the key to overcoming humanity's tragic propensity for ideological thinking, and we encourage you to find such a community, join it, help create one, or support such a community financially. If you're interested, I can point you to local groups of that sort if you corner me after the event. So last year, we bestowed the initiative's inaugural Carl Sagan Prize on Steven Pinker, the eminent Harvard psychologist. Dr. Pinker honored us with his presence and a tour de force talk about the future of violence. It was a beautiful example of work that is both solidly evidence-based and genuinely uplifting. Violence has been in decline for centuries. Just over a year ago, I remember thinking, it doesn't get any better than this. I may have to revise that opinion. For this year, we have with us one of the most important thinkers of our time, a man with impeccable scientific and humanitarian credentials. I cannot do justice to his accomplishments, but I offer this summary for those unfamiliar with his work. His innovative expositions illuminate the remarkable power and beauty of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. His theoretical work has deepened our understanding of the logic of natural selection. He coined the term meme and showed that Darwinian thinking can be applied to cultural phenomena. As Oxford University's Simony Professor of the Public Understanding of Science, he has penned beautifully poetic tributes to science, inquiry, and wonder. He's won dozens of awards for his writing, his scholarship, and his courageous advocacy. Though controversial, he has always comported himself with grace, intelligence, and composure. His best-selling book, The God Delusion, empowered millions of non-believers to come out of the closet and say things like, you know, secular values just might serve us better. Can we at least have that conversation? He invariably appears on lists of the world's top thinkers, and in 2013, an expert panel chosen by Prospect magazine named him the most important thinker of our time. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Dawkins is in the house. It's my privilege to present him with our 2017 Carl Sagan Prize, which reads, Carnegie Mellon University's Humanism Initiative recognizes Richard Dawkins for inspired devotion to freedom of inquiry, tireless promotion of humane values, and outstanding contributions to our shared grasp of the human condition. With this, the initiative's 2017 Carl Sagan Award, November 7th, 2017. Please join me in recognizing our 2017 Carl Sagan honoree, Dr. Richard Dawkins.
I go here, right?
Mr. Dawkins, yes, we call this the hot seat. Please make yourself comfortable. So Professor Dawkins has agreed to share his thoughts on a number of issues, but we've chosen a conversational format. I've polled the local community for questions and have the responsibility of weaving them into conversation. And I'll apologize in advance for all question submitters that I don't get to. I had to pick and choose. First, may I call you Richard?
Of course, yes.
Thank you very much. Welcome to Carnegie Mellon.
Can I be heard? Does my mic work?
How are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you. I've been traveling around the country and feel quite well on it.
I understand you stopped in Las Vegas.
That was the first stop, yes.
Blackjack?
I was told, there was a tweet that said that when you're on a plane to Las Vegas, the atmosphere in the plane is happy. And when you're on the plane from Las Vegas, you can smell the despair.
And did you feel the despair?
I stayed away from all that. I know the odds are stacked in favor of the house. I got more sense.
Okay. Imagine so. So I'm curious, did you ever meet Carl Sagan?
I did meet him once. I can't claim to have been a friend of his, but I met him in London he and I were both guests at a celebration of Nature magazine, one of the leading magazines, scientific magazines. And I met him and had a very pleasant conversation with him. I was an enormous admirer of his books, his television programs. I recently was ill, and during my recuperation, I went right through the whole of Cosmos, and then I went right through the whole of Neil deGrasse Tyson's remake of Cosmos. They're both very good. And I've loved his books. I think he is a brilliant writer, a prose poet. I think that he should have won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And it's time that a scientist did win that, because science is such a wonderful vehicle for great writing. And I think Carl Sagan exemplifies that more than anybody else I can think of.
I'm wondering if Carl Sagan was an inspiration for the formation of the professorship you occupied at Oxford so many years, which professor for the public understanding of science?
Yes, this was endowed by Charles Simonyi, who is one of the Microsoft founders. I'm pretty sure Charles probably is an admirer of Carl Sagan, but I don't think the name of Carl Sagan was written into the charter that Charles wrote, but he easily could have been.
And has Carl's example helped shape the person you've become?
I admire him as a writer. He was an astrophysicist, a planetary scientist. I'm a biologist. He wrote some biology as well, by the way, the Dragons of Eden. Yes. And so I'd say I've been influenced by his approach to science, his approach to rationality, his writing style. The demon-haunted world could well be, I mean, that should really replace the Gideon Bible in every hotel in the world.
Since you happened on that subject, let's see if we can stake out a little common ground with religious brothers and sisters here. I bet some of them will be surprised to learn that you once advocated for a movement called Atheists for Jesus. So what was that about?
I think somebody sent me a T-shirt that said Atheists for Jesus. It inspired me to write a column for Free Inquiry, which is one of the magazines published by the Center for Inquiry, which my foundation has just merged with. Well, I think that Jesus was one of the best human beings that's ever lived. Whether he lived or not, even if he was a fictional character, whoever invented him invented one of the best human beings who ever lived. The Sermon on the Mount is way ahead of its time. I'm not sure that I would say that Christianity, as invented by St. Paul, is a particularly good code by which to live. But Jesus himself, I think, was a very good person. I went so far in my article as to say that Jesus, if he were alive today, would certainly be an atheist.
It doesn't sound like you've reconciled with God, however.
Well, which God?
I understand that you have issues with the creator you do recognize, however, and if I remember your language from The Selfish Gene, it was that something about rebelling against the tyranny of the selfish genes?
Yes, well, the whole of The Selfish Gene is about the gene as the unit of selection. Natural selection is all about the differential survival of genes in gene pools. That's what happens in evolution. Genes change in frequencies in gene pools and under influence of random chance and under the influence of non-random selection. So to the extent that, which is a very considerable extent, that animals are well designed to do whatever they do, whether it's flying or digging or running or jumping or climbing, they have been shaped by generations of natural selection of genes. Genes in gene pools are the only permanent things that go on from generation to generation. Individual organisms die, having reproduced and passed on the genes that help them to survive, to reproduce. So every creature ever born is descended from a long line of successful ancestors, ancestors, every single one of whom achieved at least one heterosexual copulation. Many of their contemporaries didn't. That means survived long enough to reproduce, survived in whatever complicated ways the species adopts. And so the genes that enabled those individuals to survive got passed on, and we, the survivors, we, the contemporaries, we animals, we plants, we fungi, we, all of us, inherit the genes that helped our ancestors to survive. So the gene is the unit of selection. The individual body is a survival machine for the propagation, the preservation and propagation of the genes that ride inside it. If the vehicle dies before it reproduces, the genes die with it. So the gene is the unit of selection, and the selfish gene means that those genes that work through individual bodies by manipulating individual bodies to preserve themselves are the ones that survive. Altruistic genes, genuinely altruistic genes, that give up their own survival prospects for others would not survive. But altruistic genes that make individuals altruistic could very well survive. And much of the book, The Selfish Gene, is actually about individual altruism. That phrase you quoted, rebel against the tyranny of the selfish replicators, I was trying to downplay the idea of selfishness, it being in the title of the book, and say, we humans are unique in our power to depart from the Darwinian heritage which has made us. Every other creature that's ever been born has worked to survive and to propagate its genes. We don't do that necessarily. We are machines, we are survival machines for our genes. But we don't spend all our time rushing around trying to propagate our genes. We spend our time writing books, writing poems, writing music, trying to win football matches, trying to be nice to people. We do all kinds of things which are only indirectly related to the survival and propagation of our genes. And you could call that rebelling. I did call that rebelling against the tyranny of the selfish replicators.
And by calling them the replicators tyrannical, you seem to be saying that sometimes the right thing to do is to defy our selfish...
Yes, I mean, I think that if we were to model our moral behavior and our political behavior on what is best for our selfish genes, then this would be a very unpleasant, nasty society in which to live. It would be a kind of Thatcherism, and worse. Yes, this species, Homo sapiens, uniquely has the ability to say, no, I'm not going to spend all my time propagating my genes. Steven Pinker, my predecessor in this honor, once said, I don't want to reproduce, and if my selfish genes don't like it, they can go jump in the lake.
Very good. I had misquoted you in that passage from The Selfish Gene, and you corrected me on it. Your actual language was tyranny of the selfish replicators, not tyranny of the selfish genes. And I know that the replicator is a broader term, so I'm asking about what other sorts of tyrannical replicators...
Yes, well, I'm fascinated by the idea that Darwinian natural selection is a more general process, a more generally powerful process than merely works on this planet. I stick my neck out and say that if there is life elsewhere in the universe, and presumably there is, but for statistical grounds, then however varied and alien and strange and unworldly that life may be, one thing I'm confident of, it will be Darwinian life. There is no other, there's no other known way for complexity to evolve, and I suspect there's no other way for complexity to evolve. And that means there's got to be selection of something equivalent to genes, but it won't be DNA. That would be too much of a coincidence. It'll be something like DNA, something that has the same properties of DNA, particularly replication and influence over its own probability of being replicated. So DNA both replicates and by controlling protein, mostly enzymes, influences its own probability of being replicated. And that's why you can say that successful genes survive. They survive because they influence their own, influence the bodies in which they sit. That principle, I think, will prove to be universal of life everywhere. So although it won't be DNA, and it's lovely to speculate about what it might be, I'd love to talk to chemists about the alternatives to DNA, what other kinds of self-replicating entity could do the job. But whatever it is, it will be something self-replicating. And so that was the purpose of my using the word replicator as opposed to gene in that sentence.
If I'm not mistaken, you also cited memes as an analogous case right here on this planet.
I mean, I think the interesting case is the speculating about extraterrestrial life. But I then said, well, maybe we don't have to go to other planets in order to see an example of a replicator, which could potentially be the basis of a Darwinian selection process. Maybe there's one staring us in the face on this planet. So the unit of cultural inheritance is the meme. And anything that is imitated from brain to brain, whether it goes directly from one person to another, whether it goes via a book or via the internet or via a tape recording, a disc recording, any kind of copying that goes on, accurate copying, is potentially grist to the mill of natural selection, therefore a replicator by analogy with DNA. And a meme, I just coined the word meme as it doesn't exactly rhyme with gene, but it's vaguely similar to gene, as the unit of cultural selection. So something like a tune which is catchy. The very word catchy tells its story. It's catchy, it means it gets caught like an epidemic. It spreads. A popular tune spreads, people whistle it, they hear it, they whistle it, and other people hear it and hum it, and so on. A clothes fashion. Wearing shorts that dangle around your shins. Wearing a baseball hat backwards. Both those two things lower the IQ by at least 10 points. But they're catchy, they spread. There's an epidemic of them.
Here in 2017, Richard, your choice of the term tyrannical replicators almost makes it sound like you anticipated Russian Facebook posts.
It's a very sinister thing, what's happening to our democracy at the moment, and people are now beginning to uncover how social media have been used, not just in a direct way of spreading memes, but actually sampling counting the number of times you click like, knowing what people like and using that. That's an order of magnitude more sinister than I thought of when I was coining the term meme.
So I'm going to ask a somewhat more personal question. I know you identify as an atheist. Do you also identify as a humanist?
Yes, I think humanism is a kind of political moral wing of atheism. Some people call themselves humanists who are actually religious. I mean, I think that... Yes.
We have some in our group.
I expect so, yes. And I mean, Gandhi, I think could be called a religious humanist. I think most humanists are probably atheist, and it sort of adds something. It adds a concern for moral welfare, and I slightly shy away from the term because it implies maybe a little bit too much priority to the human species as opposed to sentient beings generally.
A little species-centric.
But the word humane covers that, so maybe I'm a humanist.
All right.
And by the way, the word atheist also has a kind of sinister ring to it. It's simply from the Greek a-theist. So maybe just change the emphasis. I'm not an atheist, I'm an atheist. Doesn't that sound less threatening somehow? More gentle? Less strident?
I know that many people mistake atheism for the denial of God's existence as opposed to simply the recognition that one lacks
Yes.
belief in God.
Yes. True. Well, when T.H. Huxley coined the term agnostic, he pretty much meant what you have just defined as atheist. And so the terminology is actually rather unclear. Some people use the word agnostic to mean you have so little idea that you think it's exactly equally likely that there is or is not a supernatural being.
So I take it you're not an agnostic in that sense.
Certainly not in that sense. I probably am in the sense of T.H. Huxley and Charles Darwin himself, by the way, who called himself an agnostic. But when he was talking to a well-known atheist called Edward Aveling explained to him that his atheism was what you, Andy, have just said, pretty much in the same words. And Darwin said, oh, well, in that case, I agree with you. I mean, so there is terminological confusion there, I think.
When we're on the subject of identity labels, I believe you describe yourself in the subtitle of your latest book as a passionate rationalist.
Yes.
I wonder if you could unpack that term for us. What is a passionate rationalist?
Subtitles are made up by publishers rather than...
Do you deny the charge?
No, I don't. I think American publishers particularly think that a book is somehow incomplete, it's sort of naked unless it's got a subtitle. Try to imagine what the subtitle of Hamlet might have been. A passionate rationalist, yes, I am. I think I'm passionate. I hope I'm rational. I am passionate in the cause of rationalism. The Richard Dawkins Foundation, now merged with the Center for Inquiry, is all about rationalism. It's all about reason, logic, living by evidence, believing things only when there's evidence for it, and deducing conclusions by logic from evidence. I'm passionate about that. Yes, I'm a passionate rationalist.
All right, good. I'm gonna. So I take it that rationalism, even of the passionate variety, involves commitments of various kinds. And I'm wondering how the commitments of a passionate rationalist differ from religious commitments.
Well, I suppose a religious commitment, in the sense in which I use the term at any rate, is a commitment to something supernatural. And so you believe that there is more in the universe than physics and chemistry and all that follows from that. And I'm certainly against that. It also, I suppose, has moral implications. A religious person doesn't necessarily, but can derive their morals from a sort of absolutist conviction. Something is wrong. And that's all there is to it. It just is wrong. So abortion is wrong, and I won't listen to any argument. Whereas for me, what's right and wrong depends upon who suffers, how much they suffer, what we can do to make sentient beings happier and reduce the unhappiness of sentient beings.
And it sounds as though your conviction that suffering matters it is held in a way that's provisional, in the same way that if something were to persuade you that was not true, if evidence were to persuade you that that's not true, you would revise that view?
I suppose that's right. I mean, if somebody could produce evidence that lettuces could feel pain, I would give up salad. And so obviously it's very difficult to know about suffering, but I think you and I probably agree that we need to think rationally about suffering and base our morals upon it.
I believe Peter Singer, you were having a conversation with Peter Singer, the Princeton philosopher who's famous for having argued for, among other things, animal ethics and animal rights. I believe he got you to concede at that gathering that being a vegan is morally superior.
Yes, I think it is. I'm too cowardly to do it, but yes. I'm on the way. I mean, I'm purely vegetarian at home, but not. But I haven't yet reached the stage when I'm invited out to dinner of saying, I'm vegetarian, you've got to prepare something special for me.
So you've been claiming in recent years, Richard, that, that there's no such thing as a Christian child, no such thing as a Muslim child. Isn't this just contradicted by the evidence? And if not, can you explain your view?
Well, I'm passionate. I really am passionate about this. I'm passionate about labeling children with the opinions of their parents. It's one thing for a person to say, in my opinion, I'm a Buddhist or a Christian or a Jew or something. But to say this 2-year-old child is a Christian child, I can make the point, I suppose, by saying this child is an existentialist child. This 2-year-old is a postmodernist 2-year-old. This one is a logical positivist child. This one is a Gramscian Marxist child. You get the point as soon as I say that. And yet, if I said this is a Muslim child or a Christian child, a Catholic child, a Protestant child, oh, fine, of course. I mean, we all say that all the time. Why do we let them get away with it? Why let them get away with talking about a Christian child when we wouldn't dream of letting them get away with talking about a whatever I just said, existentialist child, postmodernist child, etc.
But I think there's more to your passion here than just the failure to treat analogous cases analogously. I suspect you also believe that some harm is done when we force identity labels on children before the age where they can actually choose their own identity.
Yes, I do think that. And when we hear things like the population of France will be 50% Muslim by the year 2080 or something, that is based entirely upon a demographic projection that any child of Muslim parents is automatically, by definition, a Muslim child. That's wicked. But that's what we do. We make that assumption. I think even more wicked, of course, is indoctrinating children with really horrible beliefs like belief in hell. If you're wicked in your life, you will go to hell. That wouldn't matter if they didn't really believe it, but people do believe it. There are people who actually go to their grave in terror when they're adult because they were brought up as children to believe that they're going to roast in a lake of fire. And in some extreme cases, when their skin has been seared off the body by the heat, a new skin will grow in order to, so that it can be peeled off again by the heat. I mean, this is, I think one of my laws is something like Dawkins' law of, I forget exactly how I put it, but the more ridiculously extreme punishment is, the more implausible it is, the more extreme it has to be in order to carry weight. So a threat like, if you do wrong, you will be fined $20. Okay, if you do wrong, you will roast for all eternity in hell. Because the threat is so implausible, it has to be a very, very, very draconian threat in order to carry any weight. But to put a threat like that on a child, and threats which we know carry on influencing the psychology of adults right through their life, is deeply, deeply wicked.
I take it you would also object to labeling an 8-year-old a humanist child or a rationalist child.
Yes, I would that 8 is maybe getting on the borderline of where it might be okay, but I was once at an atheist conference, and there were lots of children there, children of people at the conference, and they were playing around and having a lovely time, and there was a special little room where they could play, and they had a minder and things, which was lovely. And then somebody stood up on the platform and said, "All you little atheist children, come up on the platform." I blew a gasket. I was furious.
Are you familiar, Richard, with the research of Dan Kahan, I believe his name is pronounced, at Yale?
No.
So this is a decision scientist or perhaps a psychologist whose big idea, as I understand it, is that human beings exhibit a very distinct tendency to protect the identities they've adopted, and protect them in the sense that they'll warp their thinking and even fool themselves in order to protect the identity they've chosen. So we have a very powerful need to feel as though we're virtuous, that the team we play for is on the side of the angels. And so even when we adopt labels like humanist and rationalist, there's a danger there that our thinking will become irrationally protective of the identity we've adopted. Should we avoid or should we forswear all isms?
I think it's a real risk, and I think it's something that we all need to be aware of. And I think we all need to look into ourselves from time to time and say, am I doing this? So yes, I think it's a good point.
I know you know Rebecca Goldstein. In fact, I was at her birthday party at the New York Academy of Sciences when you Skyped in with a birthday tribute to Rebecca, a lovely tribute. And Rebecca's done some really interesting work on the human need to matter. And have you?
You told me about it last night, but
I didn't want to catch you completely by surprise. But so her hypothesis is that the need to matter runs so deep that people will do or say or believe almost anything in order to not to feel as though they don't matter. So I'm wondering if it's even possible to sell rationalism in a world that affords so few people roles that give them a deep sense of mattering.
yes, could it be that German pilot who deliberately crashed a plane, would that be an example? Do you remember the case? He was a German airline pilot, and he deliberately crashed the plane killed all the passengers, so that his name would be in the paper. Is that mattering? That would be.
Yeah, I think most people would prioritize. So one way to matter is to make a difference for good. Another way to matter is to make a difference for bad. And I think most people feel as though both of them are preferable to not mattering at all, which has a peculiar kind of horror.
Yes.
To it.
Or shooting up a church in Texas.
Right. Yeah. So how can we build a society where people's need to matter is fulfilled such that they don't have to shoot up churches, such that they don't have to indulge in destructive ideological thinking?
I don't know. Give everybody their 15 minutes of fame. Yes. No, I haven't a clue, actually. I really haven't.
We'll have to ask Rebecca, perhaps,
yes.
on that score. I think Rebecca Goldstein is one of my intellectual heroes, along with Richard Dawkins. And I think she's really onto something important when she draws our attention to the concept of mattering. And it makes me want to ask you this question, because I've always wanted to ask you this. We sometimes speak of some things as really mattering, say the suffering of sentient creatures, and we sometimes speak of other things as not mattering, such as if somebody chose to devote their life to counting the blades of grass on a baseball diamond, we'd say, bad choice, that doesn't really matter. So we speak of some mattering as real, other mattering as not real, which leads me to wonder about whether we can talk scientifically about what really matters.
I suppose the person counting blades of grass could be trying to get his name into the Guinness Book of Records for counting more blades of grass than anybody else.
One way to matter.
The Guinness Book of Records could be a a testament to people trying to matter in all sorts of trivial ways. Yeah. What was your question again?
Yeah. Well, do you think it makes sense? Can we speak scientifically about what really matters? So, look, the prevailing assumption is that the moment you transition from factual discourse to value discourse, that basically objectivity in science, you're no longer engaged in scientific talk or scientific inquiry. But it seems to me that we need to be able to talk about what matters in ways that are responsible and objective.
Yes. Well, I suppose in science we have to worry about this because many people think that academic blue skies science doesn't matter. Science only matters if it has an impact upon the welfare of humanity. Sarah Palin, when she was campaigning, dug up some story that's somebody, I kid you not, is doing research on fruit flies. So
That's appalling, by the way.
in her ignorant mind, she was implying that that didn't matter. Little did she know that just about everything we know about genetics has been. But scientists are often accused of doing things that don't matter. And there was a senator. What was his name? Senator began with P. Proxmire. Senator Proxmire used to give a sarcastic award every year to a piece of science which to him obviously didn't matter. Experience tells us that all sorts of scientists have done things that apparently didn't matter at the time and turned out to matter. So it is a thing that scientists think about a lot and worry about a lot and need to defend what they do against the likes of Senator Proxmire and Sarah Palin. And it's not an easy defense because science is expensive, of course, and so you have to justify the money that gets spent, and if it's large sums of government money, then there is hostility and from government and from politicians.
Your fellow horseman of the apocalypse, Sam Harris, has written eloquently about the possibility of an objective moral discourse, or about talk of right and wrong that is, if not scientific in our current sense, scientific in a slightly expanded sense, that we as a culture need to acknowledge.
Yes.
Has he won you over on that?
Well, it's an interesting book. I recommend it, The Moral Landscape by Sam Harris. Until I read the book, I subscribed to the sort of conventional view that science has nothing to say about morality. And morality, or at least the fundamental axioms of morality are subjective. And then you can use a scientific way of thinking to deduce conclusions from that. And you could use, I think objective moral philosophers do this when they point out that if you believe that so-and-so is moral, you're being inconsistent if at the same time you believe that so-and-so isn't. We're all familiar with the idea that you can use a sort of scientific logic to do moral thinking, but at the bedrock of it, the basic axioms have to come from subjective judgment. And I think what Sam Harris is saying is that even the basic axioms don't have to come from subjective judgment. I'm not quite sure what I think about that, but I think that it's almost so obvious that that we don't want to make things suffer, make people and other sentient creatures suffer, that I almost don't care. I think I'm with Sam there.
Okay, good. It occurs to me that Rebecca's language of mattering could be useful to help make Sam's case. If you take all of the facts about the world, add to it the axiom that suffering matters, or that well-being matters, suppose. I wonder if you can get a rich, objective morality with nothing more in the way of normative or value assumption.
Well, I'm sure you can, but there you've smuggled it in, and you've said that I'm going to smuggle in that suffering matters, and that's exactly what I want to do. But it is a kind of smuggling in, because somebody else might say, well, I don't think suffering matters at all. I like suffering.
I'm prepared to, I want to smuggle it in openly.
Yes,
I think, but once we recognize that, I mean, think about pain is bad is about as unproblematic an assumption as one can, I mean, compare that to Euclid's axioms. It seems more obvious to me. Than
Not quite. I mean, you could, from a biological point of view, pain is what the brain does when you do something that's going to injure you.
stand corrected.
So so something like sticking a needle into yourself, sticking a pin into yourself. The sensation of pain is the brain saying, "Don't do that again," and it's a negative reinforcer. An animal that is given a painful stimulus, having done something, is less likely to do it again. And so the biological survival value of pain is as a mechanism to prevent repetition of self-injuring acts. Now, you could breed, I'm going out on a limb here, but I'm suggesting that you could breed, by artificial selection, a race of animals that like pain, or rather, by definition, it would no longer be pain. They would like being injured. Actually, some people do like being injured, and I never got that.
Football players.
Yeah. Well, yeah, okay. There's a lovely, do we have Douglas Adams fans here? Yes. There's a wonderful scene in the restaurant at the end of the universe where the heroes sit down to dinner and a large bovine creature trots up to the table and says, "I am your dish of the day," and then recommends various parts of its body and says, "Try my liver, it's very good, and I've been exercising well, so I've got plenty of good meat in my haunches," and things like that. And then it explains that this moral dilemma of what to do about eating animals was solved by breeding a race of animals, by selective breeding, which wanted to be eaten and was capable of saying so. And the hero, Arthur Dent, is utterly horrified by this and orders a green salad. But all the others order steaks all round, very rare, and the animal contentedly says, "A very wise choice. I'm going off to shoot myself." Well, that's science fiction of a comedic kind, but I'm suggesting that it would be in theory possible to breed a race of animals where pain has the reverse effect, where instead of a sweet taste tasting pleasant and physical injury being aversive, you could breed an animal that has the opposite effect. But
I take it that would mitigate the moral problems with, say, factory farming animals if we were able
if you could, I mean, that's the point of Douglas Adams' thought experiment, yes, and it's a very funny passage. He himself acted the part of this animal. I gave the Royal Institution Christmas lectures in London to children, and I wanted to talk about this point, and I wanted to read out this book, this passage from Douglas Adams' book. It's a tradition at the Royal Institution Christmas lectures for children to call children out to do demonstrations, rather like a conjurer, a magician calls children out. And so the obvious thing would be to call a child out to come and read this passage. So I said, I've got this passage from Douglas Adams that I'd like somebody like to volunteer. So all little hands shot up. Douglas Adams was about 7 feet tall, broad in proportion. He was a gigantic man. So he came to the front, sort of mimicking a child, and I said, "What's your name?" He said, "Douglas." "Douglas what?" "Douglas Adams." And of course, I mean, we carried on the pretense that it wasn't a plant. But anyway, he then read the story and did beautiful acting with it. It was a lovely occasion.
So, in addition to being a friend of yours, Douglas is also a co-conspirator.
Yes.
So, I'm afraid that my own discipline, philosophy, has often indulged in the conceit that animals couldn't possibly suffer to the same degree that we do. But in your most recent book, I believe you conjecture that animals may actually experience more acute suffering.
Yes, I mean, going back to the point about what pain and suffering is all about, it is a Darwinian adaptation to warn the animal not to behave in such a way as to make it more likely to die, more likely to injure itself. So if that's what it's doing, then a species which is clever, you might think would need actually less pain in order to ram home the point that you mustn't do that again. An extremely intelligent species might be able to do it without any pain at all. Just a little red flag that goes up in the brain and says, "Don't do that again." But a species that isn't very bright, doesn't have very much intellectual power, would need more than a little red flag, more than just a little bit of pain. It would need a lot of pain. And so you could even make the case that species that are less intellectual than us, far from having less ability to feel pain, actually might have more ability to feel pain. I certainly think there's no particular reason to think that they feel less, but I think they might even have some reason to feel more.
I'll have the salad, please.
Yes.
So I have a few questions that were submitted by some of the student members of our group, and I hope you'll tell us what you think about some of these. So suppose we came to understand the emergence of life on Earth as neither miraculous nor unlikely, but instead a near inevitability given conditions that obtained early on the planet. Might this cause you to rethink your view that all life on Earth has a single common ancestor?
No, because all life that's ever been looked at has the same or almost the same genetic code. And the genetic code is a highly elaborate system, which is almost certainly arbitrary. And so all surviving life that's ever been looked at has one common ancestor. That doesn't mean that your questioner could be absolutely right. Life could have arisen many times on this planet, but most of those times have gone extinct, or at least we haven't found them. And Darwin himself suggested that if any did arise, they'd probably be eaten by bacteria, which they probably would. So I think it is not totally inconceivable. The physicist Paul Davies, British physicist who went to Australia and now moved to Arizona, he's looking for non-DNA-based life forms. He makes the point that on other planets, there almost certainly would be non-DNA-based life forms, but we can't go to other planets. It's too difficult to get there. You can only get to within our own solar system. So on the principle of when you've lost the man who lost his keys and was seen searching under the lamppost, and the passerby said, "Did you lose your keys under the lamppost?" "No." "And why are you searching here?" "Because that's where the light is." That's the Paul Davies principle. We're here. We can't get to other star systems. So let's just try, unlikely as it might be, let's just try to find other life forms, non-DNA-based life forms. He hasn't succeeded yet. I doubt if he will, but I wish him luck.
So, suppose we were to develop genomic interventions that increase human cognitive abilities. Would you favor making such interventions or banning them?
I would favor them. I mean, just imagine raising the average IQ by 10 points. No Donald Trump. No Brexit.
I'm not disagreeing at all, but I'm sure that there are many who would start shouting eugenics, eugenics,
Yep.
when you say such things. What do you say to
Well, eugenics has got a bad name, rightly so, and because the main person who tried to do it was Hitler. And Hitler was doing, postulating coercive genetics, forcing people, killing off people who were of the inferior so-called genetic type. And that, of course, is horrible, repugnant. And so is trying to breed, trying to force people to breed, you know, fair-haired, blue-eyed, Aryan, whatever that means, types. But what about voluntary eugenics? What about using IVF, in vitro fertilization? You already have in vitro fertilization for people who have difficulty conceiving. And what you do is you inject hormones into a woman, cause her to superovulate, make lots of eggs, put the eggs in a petri dish, fertilize them with her husband or partner's sperm, and then choose 2 or 3 to put back in the womb. Now, the 2 or 3 that you choose out of the dozen that are in the petri dish are chosen at random. Suppose that this couple is vulnerable to giving birth to a hemophiliac child. So you know that half the eggs, half the zygotes in the petri dish are going to be hemophiliac and the other half aren't, they're male. Well, would you choose them at random? Of course you wouldn't. If you could choose, if you had the facility, the knowledge to choose the non-hemophiliac ones, it would be positively immoral to do anything else. The same would go for any genetic disease. I can't see that anybody could have a legitimate objection to negative eugenics, removing hereditary diseases like hemophilia, like Tay-Sachs, like Huntington's chorea. That would be an unequivocal benefit. It's more controversial if you move on to positive eugenics. We couldn't do it now, but suppose the technology of the future would know that of these zygotes in the petri dish, some of them contain the J.S. Bach gene for musical genius. I think I would rather like to choose the musical genius gene to put, wouldn't you? I can't see why that would be immoral. But I do, of course, think that coercive genetic eugenics of the Hitler type is appalling.
So another one of our student humanists is interested in getting a biologist's perspective on race. So some people claim that race is fundamentally a biological thing. Others claim that it's a social construct. What's your view on this?
Well, if you look at the distribution of genes in the human species, we are a very uniform species. Compared to chimpanzees, for example, we are a more uniform species genetically, rather surprisingly, because clearly we look different. I don't think it's reasonable to say we only look different because we are human, and therefore we can see the differences. I mean, the difference between a black person and a white person is too obvious to be written off as being a social construct. We are relatively uniform, genetically speaking, relatively uniform. We are clearly one species. And on the other hand, if you were to do a test of getting people from Uganda, from China, from Norway, from India, from Australian Aboriginal, and you were to ask people to guess where each one came from, anybody in this room, everybody would be 100% right. There's absolutely no difficulty, no problem in knowing precisely which of those people came from which country. So superficially, the characteristics which we have on our faces, on our skin, are clearly geographically labeled local populations. That's what race is. So yes, race is a real biological phenomenon, but it is, and it's clearly not a social construct. But we are a very uniform species, and the important point is that to base any kind of discrimination on race is deeply immoral. To say, I'm going to give a job to a person of this race rather than that race. Don't ever do that. That would be deeply immoral. So racism is exceedingly evil, but race itself is a real biological phenomenon.
I mentioned before that you're occupying the hot seat, and here I have a question from one of our religious humanists. Do you think we have more evidence for the existence of other minds than we do for the existence of God?
Other minds?
That I, for example, have a real mind as opposed to just
yes,
the external appearance.
I'm the only person in the room who has a mind, and all the rest of you are
figments
of my imagination. Solipsism. Bertrand Russell told a lovely story that he had a letter from a lady who said, "Dear Lord Russell, I'm so glad to hear you are a solipsist. There are so few of us around these days." The evidence for other minds seems to me to be exceedingly strong. We all come into the world in the same way. We've all evolved from the same ancestors. We were all born in the same way. We all grew up in the same way. We behave in the same way. Everything that I do, I recognize in other people. So yes, everybody has a mind.
So I'm imagining a theist, a believer in God who has had experiences that felt very much like evidence. So can you imagine people having spiritual experiences of a sort that would count as evidence for a God's existence?
Well, they're private, aren't they? They're not. I mean, they're extremely hard not to say that's a hallucination. You have this immensely strong conviction that you're communicating with some other, but nobody else can see it or hear it or
So your concept of evidence involves something public, something that can be used to decide between the competing hypotheses?
I suppose so. I mean, we know where other brains come from. We know where each other's brains come from, and so the enormous weight of evidence is that we understand the whole process of embryology, of evolution, of physics, of chemistry, everything that gives rise to what is each other, and so the words that come out of another person's mouth are produced by a brain that we can understand from our knowledge of science, from our knowledge of biology, from our knowledge of brain physiology, and so on. Whereas this person who has a private conviction that he's talking to an imaginary friend, that seems to me to be obviously far less convincing. It's a private thing. It's no more convincing than the person who is convinced that he's Napoleon or a poached egg.
And the evidence of Scripture doesn't qualify as evidence in your...
Oh, no, of course not. Scripture, I mean, there are just so many different scriptures, and they all clearly come from different places, different things, different cultures. The particular scriptures, I don't know whether your question has in mind the New Testament or the Old Testament, but the historical evidence for the validity of, say, the Gospels is exceedingly weak. The Gospels were written, nobody knows who wrote them. They certainly weren't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were written decades after the alleged death of Jesus. And the oldest documents in the New Testament are actually the epistles, which say very, very little about Jesus.
I guess part of what I'm pressing towards is can you give us some more general account of what counts as evidence?
Well, observation which is publicly repeatable, preferably experimental, by which I mean that you don't just observe, but you engineer something, and you observe systematically and analyze statistically what happens when you experimentally manipulate the world. So it's not just a coincidental effect. Mostly we don't have time to do that, of course. Mostly we rely on our sense organs. And there are certain things where we know our sense organs mislead us, but other times they don't. Sort of simple things like this is a table and this is a chair. We sort of accept that without bothering to go and do scientific experiments. But I think we sort of know what we accept as evidence in everyday life. But when you get philosophical about really difficult things, then you have to start thinking more carefully about what you mean by evidence.
I have one more student question, which is going to ask you to play a bit of a prophet here, I believe. Do you think our species will be around in 200 years? Why or why not?
The astronomer royal, Martin Rees, has written a book in which he gives us a 50-50 chance of surviving to the end of this century. And that there are various reasons for pessimism. Most species that have ever lived have gone extinct, and for various reasons. We might avoid the fate of the dinosaurs. I mean, we have the technology, as people say. So I think there's a pretty good chance that some humans will be around. We have to be pessimistic about things like climate change, which are maybe too late to do anything about that. There's the possibility of deliberately man-made catastrophe like nuclear war, biological war, terrible weapons getting out of the hands of what we think of as responsible government, what we used to think of as responsible government, and into the hands of rogue groups who actually want to die a martyr's death, for example. So there are reasons for pessimism, but I would expect that in 200 years, yes, I think there will be humans around.
Good. So
the loveliest story, I think it's Lawrence Krauss's story about a physicist explaining that in whatever it is, 5 billion years, the sun will swell and burn up the Earth. And somebody at the audience said, "Did you say 5 billion or did you say 5 million?" No, 5 billion.
So we won't be taking questions from the audience today, but we do encourage you to bring your thoughts and your questions upstairs to our apple pie reception. You'll have a chance there to discuss your thoughts and your reactions with your fellow audience members and with the members of the Student Humanist League. That will take place almost directly above us, as Jeremy mentioned before. It's in a room called Rangos 1, directly above us. If you go out this door, there's a stairwell up one floor. Look for the sign that says Rangos 1. We hope you'll join us for that. But before you leave, please join me in thanking Dr. Richard Dawkins.